The Ryzen 1000 series launched back in March of 2017. That's 6 years ago, getting pretty close to 7 years now. So can the Ryzen 1000 series CPU still provide a playable experience in 2024? And if not, what AM4 series CPU will work best for you? Let's find out. What's up everyone, Eric here and welcome to Hardware for Gamers. For those of you who are new to the channel, I test and review PC cases, CPU coolers, PC case fans, and graphics cards. Before I get into this, to have full disclosure, I bought all these CPUs and the graphics card that I used in this video myself. So if you do end up liking this video, please hit that like button and maybe subscribe to the channel as well, because it really does help a lot. So says YouTube anyways. Now with the housekeeping out of the way, I've been wanting to make this video for quite some time now, and I finally had a chance to actually make the time to do all this testing. What I've done is paired an RX 6750 XT with 5 AM4 CPUs, the Ryzen 5 1500X, the Ryzen 5 2600, the Ryzen 5 3600, the Ryzen 5 5600, and the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D. All these CPUs were running at their stock frequencies, so no overclocking. I tested each CPU at 1080, 1440, and 2160, or UHD, in 13 benchmarks, using the high or ultra graphical presets. The system I used for all the testing was my standard GPU bench, but for the 1500X and the 2600, I ran the test with only 2 DIMMs, or 16 gigs, since I was unable to get all 4 DIMMs to run stably at their rated 3200. Doing all this took me the better part of 3 days, running through nearly 1,000 passes to get all these results. So if you do end up finding this video helpful, please hit that like button. As I said before, I'm looking to find out if the Ryzen 1000 series can still provide a good gaming experience in 2024, and that is when it's paired with a good mid-range 2024-2023 graphics card, and using graphical presets that you might actually be using when you're playing these games. What my testing revealed may not be overly surprising to many of you, but it is still very interesting to me at least. I won't be going over all the games I tested in hopes to save some time, but I will have the FPS breakdowns of the older CPUs after I go over the games. Taking a look at Apex Legends first, at 1080p there wasn't too much of a difference between the average FPS of all 5 CPUs here, but when looking at the 1% lows, the 1500X and the 2600 do fall off a fair bit comparative to the other 3 newer CPUs. At 1440p, both the average and 1% lows of all 5 CPUs are much more comparable, while at 2160 it is completely GPU bound. Now for Counter-Strike 2, telling a fairly different story here, at 1080p the 5600 and the 5800X 3D have a much higher average FPS than the older AM4 CPUs. Although the average FPSs are very similar, the 1% low of the 5800X 3D are still much higher than the 1% lows of the 5600 are. At 1440p, the 3600, 5600, and the 5800X 3D are much more even for both the average FPS and 1% lows. Then at UHD, all 5 CPUs are pretty much providing the exact same experience here. I do want to note the average and 1% lows of the 1500X don't really change between any of these resolutions, so CS2 is pretty CPU intensive, which many of you probably already knew that. In Cyberpunk, at 1080p, there is a nice performance boost with each newer generation of Ryzen CPU. At 1440p, most of the CPUs are now being bottlenecked by the GPU. Then at 2160 or UHD, it is completely GPU bound. Destiny 2 at 1080p is similar to CS2 and Cyberpunk, where there is a nice performance boost with each newer version of the Ryzen CPUs. But unlike CS2 and Cyberpunk, Destiny 2 still sees this performance boost at 1440. However, at 2160, we see a pretty similar experience with each CPU. In Halo Infinite, using the high preset gives us pretty much no noticeable difference between any of these CPUs at all 3 resolutions. In Hitman 3, all 5 CPUs give a highly playable experience at all 3 resolutions for this style of game. Overwatch 2 tells a very familiar story at 1080p. There is a nice performance boost with each newer generation of Ryzen CPU. The 5600 and the 5800X3D do have a very similar average FPS, but again, the 5800X3D does provide a much higher boost to the 1% lows. At 1440p, there is still a large performance difference between the 1500X and 2600 when compared to the newer CPUs. These performance differences do also show in the 1% lows. In the Vulkan version of Rainbow Six Siege, we see the familiar CPU generational boost at 1080p, but at 1440 and 2160, we see a hard GPU bottleneck. Finally, in War Thunder, all 5 CPUs give a highly playable experience at all 3 resolutions. However, the 5000 series Ryzen CPUs give a massive boost to the average and 1% lows at both 1080 and 1440. However, at 2160, all the CPUs are being pretty much bottlenecked by the GPU. Not overly surprising. Now for the FPS breakdowns. The 5600 was on average 58% faster than the 1500X in my testing at 1080p. There were 3 games that the 1500X couldn't achieve an average FPS of 60 at 1080p, those being Cyberpunk 2077, 40K Dark Tide, and Watch Dogs Legion. At 1440, the 5600 was only 28% faster than the 1500X, and that's because many of these games were being bottlenecked by the GPU, testing at 1440 with the graphical presets I used. At 2160, the 5600 was only 2% faster than the 1500X, which isn't overly surprising since this is a mid-range GPU trying to do UHD. It's not really meant to do this kind of resolution. So you do find yourself having massive GPU bottlenecks here. The 5600 was 36% faster than the 2600 at 1080p. The 2600 was good enough to maintain an average FPS of at least 60 in all the games I tested, at 1080p that is. At 1440, the 5600 was 16% faster than the 2600. There were 2 games that the 2600 couldn't achieve an average FPS of 60 in, those being Cyberpunk and 40K Dark Tide. At 2160, the 5600 was only 2% faster than the 2600, which again, since this is a mid-range GPU, not very surprising. Now, the 3600 was 15% faster than the 2600, while the 5600 was 16% faster than the 3600 at 1080p in my testing. The 3600 was able to maintain a 60 FPS average in all the games I tested at 1080p, but wasn't able to keep its 1% lows above 60 in Cyberpunk and 40K Dark Tide. At 1440, the 5600 was only 8% faster than the 3600. There was only 1 game that the 3600 couldn't achieve an average FPS of 60 in, and that was 40K Dark Tide. At 2160, the 5600 was only 0.5% faster than the 3600, which again, it's because it's GPU bound, and if you're playing at UHD, CPU doesn't really matter too much. You want a more powerful GPU. Kind of the point I'm trying to get across here. So what can we take away from this? One thing is for sure, and that is I did way more testing than I actually needed to. However, by me doing way more testing than I needed to, does give us a much broader understanding of what a mid-range GPU is actually capable of. So if you do were planning to upgrade your GPU to a 6650, a 6750, a 7600, a 7700 XT, or an RTX 3070, 4060 Ti type thing, or hell, even any of the new 40 series supercards that are about to drop, and you're still on a 1st or 2nd gen Ryzen CPU, you're likely going to want to upgrade because you're going to be leaving a lot of performance on the table. Now, if you do have a 60Hz panel, it doesn't really matter what resolution that 60Hz panel is. The 1st and 2nd generation Ryzen CPUs are just really not going to work for you anymore. The IPC is just not good enough for today's games. You will want at least a 3600, likely a 5600 would be best, but based off of the average FPSs I was getting in my testing, a 3600 will do you just fine for the next year or two. After that, that's probably where you'd want to be going into the 5600 rather than, depending on how long you want to be on AM4, If you're only looking to be on AM4 for another year or two, getting a 3600 will do you just fine. However, if you have or are looking to get a high refresh rate panel, so a 144 Hz or higher, you're likely going to want a Ryzen 5000 series CPU, mainly for the 1% lows. Just having the 1% lows, or just having a much smoother experience at high refresh rates, makes high refresh rates that much better, if that makes sense. Having low 1% lows just kind of hurts the whole high refresh rate gaming thing. Now, for the majority of people, I would recommend getting a 5600, primarily because there is more than a $200 difference between the 5600 and the 5800X 3D, with not that much of a performance difference in most games when using a mid-range graphics card. So depending on what your budget is, by going with the 5600 or even the 5800X non-3D, you could get a much more powerful graphics card. An extra 250-ish USD on a graphics card could have you go from a RX 7600 to an RX 7800 XT, which is a freaking huge difference in GPU performance. So by throwing in an extra $30-ish and not getting the 5800X 3D and going with the 5600 instead, like your GPU will be on just a completely different level. Or if you don't have a high refresh rate panel, that $220 difference between those CPUs can get you a high refresh rate panel at 1080p for sure. Maybe you do have to throw in a little bit extra to get a 1440p high refresh rate panel. But again, I do think that will help your overall playing experience far more than getting the 5800X 3D. That's my 2 cents. Either way, I think pairing a 5800X 3D with a mid-range graphics card is just a waste of money. Now, if you do have a 4080 or a 7900 XT or XTX or whatever, different story. You're already at that high level of GPU and you're trying to get the most out of that. Perfectly understandable in that situation, but that's a very, very small percentage of people. So, shut. And that's all I got for this one. I do hope you found this video helpful. This is a difficult topic to cover in a video because there's so many variables and stuff. But like all in all, going with a more powerful GPU and a good CPU is typically the best thing you can do when upgrading. But if you did find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up. And if you're still watching and you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so you get notified whenever I drop a new video. There is the HFG Discord service. It is completely free to join. All you need to do is agree to the server rules and then you get to view all of my charts. A link is in the description. There is also Patreon if you'd like to support the channel directly. Again, a link is in the description. And as always, thank you very much for watching and see you next time.